Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jennifer Summers. I'm the treasurer of the Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society, and I'd like to greet you all. Thank you for joining us for our brown bag webinar series featuring Kevin Wallenfang and Curt Rollman. We're going to be talking about CWD today, so I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. But before we get started, just a few quick reminders that our WCTWS chapter meeting is coming up. If you haven't registered yet, please do. You can do so by going to our Wild Apricot website. You can just Google Wisconsin Chapter Wildlife Society and it'll come right up. And that is on March 7th through the 10th. So consider joining us for that meeting. There's going to be some excellent, there's a fur bearer symposium and another symposium about Mississippi River. A lot of really great sessions. So please consider joining us. And recently, we just learned that the National Wildlife Society, if you are interested in renewing your wildlife or earning credits towards your wildlife certificate, these webinars count for 1 credit. So, so that's a new thing. So so consider that as well. And if you're not a member, thank you for joining us, but consider joining. Consider becoming a member of Wisconsin chapter of the Wildlife Society. We have lots to offer you. These webinars are one thing. We do some trainings, and we also, of course, have our meeting every year. So please consider joining us. And then without further ado, I'd like to, Jenna will introduce our speakers today.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, so we have Kevin Wallenfang here, and I'm sure many of you guys know Kevin Wallenfang. He's been with the DNR since 1991, left for a little bit, for a few years in 2020, where he worked for the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and Pheasants Forever. In 2011, he came back and was our large game biologist for the state. And then just recently in 2021, he became the manager for the CWD Processing Center. He lives near Cross Plains with his wife of 33 years and his Jack Russell Terrier, Penny, and has a few daughters also in the area that are now in their 20s.
Just two.
Just two. Curt Rollman, he was born and raised in northern Wisconsin. He's received his bachelor's degree from UW-Madison and graduate degree from UW-Green Bay. He worked for the Wisconsin DNR for 6 years now and has been a deer biologist for almost 5. Prior to his current position, he held various roles within the DNR as an LTE and also worked for USDA Wildlife Services. He now lives in Rhinelander with his wife, Janelle, his daughter, Libby, and as of recently, 4 dogs, Maze, Twitch, Ebb, and Groove. And as of recently, he had to say goodbye to one of his best dogs, Juice. But he enjoys the Northwoods and everything it has to offer and really assists us within the deer program. So with that, I'll pass it over to Kevin Wallenfang to start his presentation.
Okay, and we're having some technical difficulties on my end today, so Jenna is going to be my designated slide turner. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to just start out with a fairly quick update of what's going on in the CWD world. And then I'm going to just turn it on over to Curt. And I'm trying to get back to some notes here. Give me 1 second. All right. So I just want to start out first by saying that everything that I'm going to tell you about, and I have to put my old man glasses on, so once you get past 50, they look stupid, but they work. So I'm a walking technical difficulty today. Test results I'm going to share with you. Everything I'm going to share with you here today is pretty much preliminary. Our sampling year goes through the end of March, so numbers are actually changing as we speak, but just wanted to make sure that you understood that situation. But without further ado, Jenna, go ahead and get me to the next slide here. Our current situation, just as a little bit of review here in Wisconsin, current situation is that we have CWD in 60 counties that we've referred to as affected counties. They could be affected because of a wild positive, a game farm positive, They could be within that 10-mile distance of an adjoining county that has a positive of some sort. So 60 CWD affected counties within the state. 37 of those are due to at least one CWD positive detection within that county. So the map there on the right kind of gives the overall view of why a county is considered CWD affected. And then the CWD affected status also affects our baiting and feeding rules here within the state. That smaller map down on the lower left shows our current baiting and feeding affected counties. And as you can see, there aren't very many left where that practice is still allowed within the state. Next slide. Our testing, we continue to do what we call surveillance testing in Wisconsin. So we have what we refer to as disease detection, and this is surveillance where CWD has not been detected within a county, or it may be that that county has a very low volume of samples in recent years, or it might be surrounding a CWD positive farm-raised deer facility where they've had a positive within that. So that's part of our surveillance testing. And then we also have what we refer to as disease assessment. And this is surveillance where CWD is known to exist, but the intent is that we continue to monitor and measure the disease patterns to understand how prevalent the disease is within an area. Surveillance continued also this year in 13 counties in those, I guess that's kind of a pinkish tannish shade, the Northeast district of the state. We have been doing a rotational surveillance over the last few years. We started out in the western part of the state a couple years ago, did some northern surveillance as well. And so this year we were back in the northwest part of the state. This will be the last year that we are conducting that rotational surveillance around the state. And then we also, in addition to what we really want to target, we do offer what we call hunter services testing. So any hunter, for his own peace of mind or her own peace of mind, whatever the situation may be, we do offer testing to pretty much anybody in the state. They may have to work a little bit harder in some cases to find a way to get that deer tested, but we do offer. Next slide, Jenna. Our overall sampling effort, as you guys can imagine, we have COVID safety protocols in place for pretty much anybody and everything that's out there to help us collect samples around the state. But we have multiple options for testing. We continue to have self-service kiosks around the state. We have a number of cooperators. These are paid cooperators. They're typically a butcher shop, taxidermist, bait shop, things like that, where people are either collecting heads or actually pulling samples for us and giving those to us. We did have one location this year down in Barneveld where we had in-person sampling during the opening weekend of the 9-day season. You'll recall last year, we completely got rid of in-person sampling because of COVID, but we had Barneveld this year as kind of a last hurrah down there. As things currently stand, the plan is that we will not have any in-person sampling at a set station in the future. And then, as I said, anywhere around the state, if somebody wants to get a deer tested, they can call DNR staff. Usually that's the local biologist or technician, and then somebody meets up with them and they do an in-person, set up an appointment and meet up with them. But at our peak of sampling this year, opening weekend of the 9-day season, we had 255 locations around the state, or options around the state, for people to get their deer tested. Next slide. We have a variety of options out there as to how hunters actually submit their data to us. We have an automated system within our the DNR's Go Wild licensing system. When a hunter registers their deer, they will automatically get, depending on the county that they're in, but they'll automatically get a message that says they can submit their information electronically, and then they can go ahead and do that through a pretty simple app. And about 13% of our submissions are coming in that way. We are hoping that we get a lot more in the future because on our end of things here at the processing center, it makes checking in a deer and tracking that deer through the system, recontacting the hunter if we need to, whatever it may be, it makes that whole thing flow beautifully. So hopefully we'll get more automated use in the future. Obviously, we also continue to have our paper data kits, which you see on the right there. We continue to try to improve that in every way we can. But what you can also see from that kit is that every deer, every kit has a unique barcode, and that barcode is really the key to helping us track that deer and keep it connected to that hunter, make sure that everybody in the state is getting back their results. There's no chance for a mix-up of any kind. We did also offer a self-sampling kit again this year. It did not get widespread use. I believe the total usage was less than 25, but if somebody wanted to contact the local wildlife biologist, they could get that kit. It had written instructions in it that they could pull the samples themselves and then drop those samples off, you know, at a kiosk or whatever the situation might be. All the samples that are submitted for testing for CWD come back here to Poinet, and we receive those, as I said, either as a field sample that's already been pulled, or we get the entire head, and then we pull those right here at the processing center. This year, we continued to receive heads from the West Central and the South Central region. We get weekly deliveries from their staff. The rest of the locations around the state chose to pull those samples themselves rather than trucking them down here. And speaking of the processing center, next slide, Jenna. We have a brand new facility now in Poinet. You recall for the first 18 years of CWD testing, we had a facility in Black Earth that was rented. And so we have since abandoned that facility. Next slide, Jenna. Nice, all new, brand new state-of-the-art facility, larger, more capacity in our freezers and coolers, more capacity to have people out here to help us test deer. It worked out beautifully this year. It's got a great flow to it. And some of you listening were probably here to help, and we appreciated that as well. Obviously, COVID rules in place, trying to make sure everybody is staying safe, utilizing primarily local staff from multiple programs to get the job done. But we ran several thousand heads through here as always this year. Things went very well. Next slide. So our final results, they're not final. Again, they're preliminary, but up to this point, February 3rd. So these are numbers from last week, and they have already changed a bit again. But we had anticipated doing up to about 21,000 samples this year. We are currently sitting just under 17,000. I'm sure we will surpass that by the end of March because there still are ag damage deer, nuisance deer, surveillance tags out there. So we will continue to receive heads here. But overall, our numbers may be down a little bit this year compared to 2020. And so far we have come up with 1,300 positives. So that also at, again, it might surpass last year, but will probably be a bit down. So on a statewide basis, prevalence under 10%, but obviously there are areas of the state, especially the original core area, where prevalence rates are significantly higher. And Dan Storm has recently shared a lot of that with us. So unfortunately this year, we have found wild detections in a few new states: Green Lake, Vilas, Oconto, Fond du Lac, and Monroe counties. All first timers that unfortunately we add to that growing list. Next slide. Despite how good things went this year, there has to be a little bit of a black eye. And unfortunately, the one that we strive to continue to improve on every year took a bit of a downturn this year. Our turnaround time when we actually get results to hunters. So we measure the turnaround time from the date that a sample is brought to a sampling station, and then when we actually get the test results available to the hunter. There's a lot of things that can affect turnaround time. You know, depending on where that animal was collected in the state, how quickly that sample gets to us at the processing center. We tend to get them out the door right away, and then they go to our partner diagnostics lab where the actual testing is performed. So we only prepare the samples here. They actually go out to a diagnostics lab for testing. And because of some staffing issues that were very much unexpected on their part, we went from a 9.5 day average turnaround time in 2020 to almost 20 days in 2021. So measures are being taken and plans in place on their part to make sure that that does not happen again. And hopefully we can get back to the standards that we had set in previous years. Back to some good on the season. We've got some good programs out there that continue to do very, very well. We've got this Adopt a Kiosk, Adopt a Dumpster, and department hosted dumpsters out there on the landscape. The Adopt a Kiosk program really has a goal to work with volunteers to help us enhance our CWD sampling numbers and to provide more ease, more options for hunters to actually get their deer tested. We have kiosks all over the state, but it's nice to see that adoption program has been growing over the years. And then we've got an Adopt a Dumpster program. And the goal there is to provide options for appropriate carcass waste disposal. And we want to do that, especially in areas where that carcass waste disposal limit available hunters who get rid of away. So volunteer dollar. There's a cost sharing program. So that has helped a lot for us to continue to help that program grow. And then in addition to that, the DNR hosted 43 dumpsters in select counties around the state as well. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but we continue also to have a meat donation program. A lot of those programs require that the meat is getting tested for CWD before it's getting distributed. That program continues to do very well. And my last slide, that's really it regarding this year, but my last slide, I just wanted to make everybody aware. There has been some research done out there on hunters' perception of chronic wasting disease and their behaviors that revolve around that, done by our Office of Applied Sciences. And there is a new one-page summary of that research out there that is got some pretty interesting numbers in it that you might want to take a look at. That's going to be posted on the department website. And I would imagine if you're interested in the full report, the best place to go for that is probably to Bob Holzman in our Office of Applied Science. And with that, I can turn it over to Curt.
All right, thank you, Kevin. I will get my screen set up here. Oops. All right, just to confirm, we're seeing my presentation, not the slides, or not the notes.
Looks good.
All right, and while Kevin was going, I did get a little pop-up that Zoom was telling me my internet connection was unstable. So if I get choppy, let me know and I can stop sharing my video. So, but with that, get started here. So yeah, Kevin went over kind of the what happened in CWD the past year. I'm jumping into now a process that is occurring right now with CWD, but it's a little bit broader. It's kind of on the management and the response spectrum. So what I'm going to talk about today is our CWD Response Plan Review. And going to talk about the review throughout the slides, of course, but I'm going to focus on kind of a new approach that we used for the review that I think will be of interest, and like I say, focus on that part of the process and less on the products of the review, because and the review is actually currently ongoing. So we're not quite done with it yet, so can't share too much of what's happening with it. But I think the process will be hopefully fairly interesting. I guess we'll find out at the end of the presentation. So as background for the CWD response plan and this review that I'm referencing, so there's a 15-year plan that guides the department's approach to addressing CWD. The plan has a stated plan goal. It has many objectives within it. And also as part of that plan, every 5 years, it gets reviewed. So it's 15-year plan, like I said, so 2010 to 2025. We're currently at the second 5-year review of that process. So meaning one review got completed already. And with that, the second review, like I say, we're currently in it. There was a new process that was looked at to this part of the review that is a little bit different than the first 5-year review. For the steps that are currently being done with the response plan review is a committee that's made up of various stakeholders, and this is a roster of the committee. This actually can be found on our external DNR website. If you type in CWD response plan in the search bar, you can find the charter for the committee as well as the roster that's showing here. The reason I want to show the roster is it has various stakeholders, and this group has been meeting for the previous 4 to 5 months, and input to the review and move a step review. Essentially where we are right now is taking the input from the committee and moving on to the next step. But like I say, the process part of this committee is what I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides, and what the committee kind of used to get their step completed. A little bit further background. So my role in this process was I was the committee leader. So I helped facilitate the meetings and work with the committee to get their input heard. Then 2 very important people that worked on it as well, and I'm not sure if they're on the call or not, but is Jen Price-Tack and Christine Anhalt-Deppies. So they were very integral in this committee process, and they worked on this part that I'm going to talk about in the next couple slides, and this is the new approach that I keep referencing. So the structured decision making. So with that, I'm going to put a pretty big asterisk on this. Jen and Christine are the experts on SDM. I just honestly heard about it 5 months ago at the beginning of this process, learned as I went, and did the best that my brain can do. So I'm going to be speaking this as from experience, of course, just going through it, but certainly not as an expert. So if Jen and Christine are on, they are more than welcome to jump in and correct me or say whatever they want for the process. But I'll be going a general overview on it and just kind of how again it worked into this response plan. So these next couple slides are more specific to this structured decision making, and then I'll work into how it was used for our process. So structured decision making, it's an approach to looking at complex issues, and kind of the bullets here are just kind of some obvious benefits of doing something like this. It's a transparent approach. It deconstructs, analyzes, and synthesizes the issue, explicitly integrates stakeholder interests. Obviously, with the previous slide, varied stakeholders in this process, very important thing to have involved. And then I think important for all natural resources issues, CWD especially, a clear role for science in the process. But really all these bullet points that are here can kind of you can see the direct connections to chronic wasting disease, and especially response. It's a complex issue, has many different moving parts. So anything that can kind of bring it down to the beginning and work through some clear steps to try and get through that process is very useful. And that's what structured decision making, I'll reference it, STM throughout, is really useful for doing. So again, focusing just kind of on STM and what it is for these next couple slides. So this is a slide from Jen, something she's used in explaining STM to both our CWD Response Plan Committee and other DNR teams. And the two real interesting points that I heard from her that really took home for me is we face a lot of complex decisions in our daily life, but especially in natural resources for DNR staff and other people working in natural resources. And essentially our brains are not evolved to handle those really complex decisions. Our brains are evolved to do the yes, no, the fight, flight type things. But when there's multi-layers to it, there's pretty good research out there showing that we don't give it the amount of thought, the amount of time needed to really get through that decision. So I thought that was a really interesting point and kind of illustrates how STM can help through some of these issues. And really, like I say, not giving it enough thought. Turns out most of these complex decisions, we talk about the issue, but essentially rush is a certain way to put it to an endpoint, or at least try to figure out ways to fix it without maybe clearly defining the problem or clearly defining what's important to us. And then after we get to those steps, then we develop a narrative kind of justifying that decision. And it can work in some instances, but again, for these more complex problems, maybe a little more structured approach will help navigate through the issue. Now, will it make the answer appear out of nowhere? Of course not. There's still complex problems, but maybe a little more structured way of looking at it. So another kind of general overview slide here is kind of comparing the more common approach, I guess you could say, to these complex decisions to structured decision making. And again, this is another Jen slide. Something I thought was really interesting here is we hear a lot in natural resources and just kind of any major decisions, science-based decision making. The decisions are based on science, and we all want that. I think that all just makes sense. And structured decision making certainly uses science, but it's important to denote that science can't make the decision for you. In the end, especially in these complex issues, values is what really drive this decision. And I think that's kind of clear in chronic wasting disease as well. So I think a really cool example that Jen uses actually from Dave McFarland is look at something like Google Maps. There's great science behind the algorithms that show you what route to take and how to avoid that construction, et cetera. But the science and those steps in the process are nothing without you having a destination, without you inputting where you want to go. So essentially SDM, the process, uses science to get you to this end step, but at the end, your values, you have to decide what that final destination is. So again, that's, I think, kind of the difference between saying that science-based decision-making rather than using science and having science help inform these steps in STM, which I'll kind of flesh out a little bit more in these next slides. So continuing on, more specific kind of STM overview, kind of a lot going on in the slide. What I'm going to focus on are these gray circles. And basically what this is just showing is the steps that are followed in this process. So again, it kind of starts at the beginning, has you tackle a problem statement. What's your goal? What's really at the core of this? And then working towards objectives. So what are your values? What's most important to you, the stakeholders, people that are involved in this process, and really try to get down to the core of it. So keep asking, why is this important, until the answer is just because. Just kind of keep working down to that. And really important to have these steps and at least a baseline for them done before you go down to the next step. One important note though is just because done, SDM isn't so rigid that you can't go back. It's actually encouraged that you go back and tweak as you go, but at least try to get something down before you move on to the next circle here, essentially. And Something that's kind of in between these circles here of objectives and alternatives is something called metrics. And metrics essentially are just ways to measure the objectives and measure if they're impacting your goal, your problem. So basically you start with the problem, you make the values, the objectives, you define measurables, metrics, and then you move to alternatives, and those are the actions. And I think a lot of us that have been in part of different committees, whether natural resources or not, realize that's where most people want to go to first. They want to go to the actions. Those are the things that get the most interest, get the people most fired up, essentially talking about for CWD, a baiting and feeding ban or something like that, without maybe trying to define exactly what is that impacting, what is that really impacting something that is core of this issue, which it very well might, but sometimes there may be conversations that could be avoided if follow through these steps. So this alternatives, that's when you start talking again about the actions, things that'll impact the metrics or impact the objectives through these measurable metrics. And then this slide here, that's where the science kind of can come into play. This is where you can use data, whether it's model data or expert elicitation or different surveys, et cetera, to measure or to provide the data to show how these actions are then impacting your objectives based on using those measurements, those metrics. So actually showing how one action may impact one objective positively and another objective negatively, then you can use that information into the next step and define trade-offs. Is it worth it to have that one activity, that one action, then positively impact objective 1, and the trade-off being a negative to objective 2, that's worth it. We value objective 1 more than objective 2. So just working through those trade-offs and kind of seeing it in a visual manner, which I'll show in the next slide how that's relayed through SDM. But again, using that data, those consequences to evaluate trade-offs, and then eventually getting to the last step of deciding and taking the action based on the information provided. So I talked about that bottom circle there, that's consequences. An output of SDM is something called the consequences table. So you have your problem statement that you identify. You have the different objectives. These are on the left side here. Then the metrics, those measurables, and then these different alternatives. Usually they're a suite of actions, so usually not just one action, or at least for the CWD process, it was a suite of actions, so multiple actions that would impact that objective. And then these cells underneath the alternatives are filled in with that data. And then that can help inform decisions of what actions are worth pursuing potentially, and you can compare and contrast those consequences. So simple example here is comparing flights. You want to make it to a meeting by noon, business trip. You want to be comfortable. You want to get there on time. You want low cost. So you have your different objectives, the things that are important to you, your values, how to measure those metrics, and then the different activities or actions, different alternative suites, or just different flights for this example. Obviously pretty clear, not one flight's gonna be the best of everything. So that's where you look at the trade-offs and the consequences of each, and you make the decision based on what objectives are most important to you, what you value the most. So again, pretty basic example there, but can move it to natural resources. Like I say, this isn't brand new. This has been used in other avenues and in natural resources. This is an example real quick from Minnesota DNR on sharp-tailed grouse harvest. So they had a question on how their harvest should look. So this is their consequences table. They have their different objectives on the left here, and then those different measurements, those different metrics, and then these different alternative options. So it was keep the season the same, shorten the season, close the season, all these different options here. And then these boxes again are filled in with that data, and then greens and yellows performing. How does that perform relative to the others? One interesting thing here, the metrics don't necessarily have to be I guess data from a model or data from a population survey. Obviously the top one here, males at Lex, that would be a population survey to some extent. This here, credibility as conservationists, that could be a human dimension survey, or it could just be essentially expert gut feeling on how do they feel there would be a reaction to choosing one of these sets of actions. So it can be a qualitative and not necessarily a quantitative metric that's used in some of these squares. And then the last thing I'll bring here is when I talk about how different objectives may be more important, there is a way through SDM to weight the objectives differently. So if one does perform better for a certain objective, if you weight that objective as very important, then that may impact the relationships and the squares, of course. All right, so like I say, not an SDM expert, and I just spent the past 5 slides talking about SDM. So like I say, I kept it fairly general, but hopefully it showed some of the benefits of it. And now I will bring it to why it was used for this CWD response plan review. Again, the process that we're currently in and working through with the committee and with the DNR teams as well. So I think it kind of goes without saying, but talking about how SDM helps with these really complex problems, CWD is a complex problem. I think that's pretty what we can all agree with, and many different stakeholder interests. It involves DEER, of course, and that there isn't a silver bullet to quote unquote fix it. And also using SDM for this helps helps work with the problem in that robust and transparent way. That first slide that I was talking about with the different bullet points, obviously very important when working with a whole suite of different decision makers and stakeholder groups, trying to do it transparently. And another nice thing about SDM, like I say, there is a previous review of this response plan, and this is the second review. If there are future reviews or future plans, this can be repeated. This can be done in a systematic way. And then lastly, sticking with keeping everyone's input and all the different stakeholder groups, trying to effectively integrate that input into the decision making. And again, SDM kind of provides a good framework for that. So bringing this whole framework into what was actually, or what is actually being done in this response plan review. So hopefully these circles look somewhat familiar from the previous figure that I shared. But they obviously have different titles because it is showing how it was integrated in this response plan review process. So you see at the top here, goal statement, also what I referred to earlier as the problem statement. So this was the first step. And even though there is a goal statement in the current response plan, we wanted to start at the base here. So started with looking at a new goal statement, if the current one needs to be altered, or just getting one down on paper, kind of starting from scratch, essentially. So the DNR team called the implementation team worked on it, as well as input from this committee that I shared the roster of earlier. And then after that, the committee then took that goal statement and looked at their objectives, what they valued, and got their objectives down and worked through that process. And then worked on the metrics, on those measurables for those objectives, and then worked down to the alternatives, the actions, which of course, like I say, most folks want to get to first. It did take us a little while. I think it took us 3, maybe even 4 meetings to get to this action part, which is difficult. It was difficult for me, because you wanted to talk about the things that are impacting the objectives that you're thinking about. But we eventually got there, got through that meeting, and then started working towards this consequences table that I shared in those other examples, and essentially filling out those squares. And speaking of SDM being this new approach, SDM allowed for a really cool opportunity to work in another kind of new approach into this review. And I should probably have separate slides on this, but I'm going to try and cram it in here. You'll notice that these two circles are a different shade of blue, and the other lighter blue ones are the Wisconsin DNR and this CWD Response Plan Review Committee focused. But these circles here also involve WDNR and the committee, of course, but have these other partners. So the National Wildlife Health Center was working with, contracting with a modeling group called Ventana. And separate from the response plan review, they've been working on this modeling effort, working on essentially a very complex model, trying to show different impacts of CWD response, and trying to really provide some really cool framework for looking at CWD management. And while we were doing SDM, SDM has that clear pathway for using modeled data, modeled outputs to put into a consequences table. So there's a clear connection there. So a portion of that model was then used to help fill out the consequences table that was created by this committee. So really cool opportunity. I think the product is going to be really interesting. Well, the product is really interesting. Working on getting it finalized now, or at least finalized for the next step in the process. But just like I say, an additional step to this whole process, and something again that's new to this review that wasn't done in the previous review, but using that model for that consequences step. And then this part here, these next light blue slides are what we're in currently, the implementation team looking at all this information from the CWD Response Plan Committee and looking at trade-offs and those different consequences, and then ultimately trying to decide how that'll look in a response plan review. Continuing on here, I know that last slide was quite a bit, went through a lot of steps, and especially that model spot. I'm sure there's a lot of questions on the model, but that would be another presentation in itself. So just want to just show how the model helped with those SDM steps and how it kind of fit in the whole process. Now, kind of continuing into what the steps look like for the committee in this review. So this is an example here of some objectives. So like I say, I'm not going to share the results of this process. It's ongoing, but some example of objectives are in the light blue squares at the top here. And then because they're so broad and CWD is so complex, we did work on some sub-objectives, and then the committee worked on those metrics, those measurables underneath those. So those are just two examples here that was a product of the SDM process. And then just a quick snippet of what a consequences table can look like from this process is you have the core objective on the left, we have our sub-objectives, and then again, those measurable metrics. So then thinking back to the airplane example, the different things to measure, to compare those objectives, and then the different essentially flights, the different action plans across the top here in these columns. So do nothing, keep everything, do nothing CWD response, a status quo, keep everything the same CWD response, and then working towards these different action lists, which again was usually a suite of actions, whether it varied geographically, varied by who did the action, etc. And then again, those squares were then filled out either by modeled information, filled out by expert elicitation, filled out by different CWD data, just different things to help fill out these squares. Now, of course, none of it is like I referenced earlier, there isn't a silver bullet out there. There's definitely limitations in the model. There's definitely limitations in the data. There's limitations in the sampling, but at least using the information that's available to try best to fill out these squares. And to help with the visualization, so obviously numbers informed these squares, data informed these squares, but for our consequences table that used a fairly coarse set of outputs here. So you'll see here, essentially, if an action performed more negatively than the status quo, it either had 1 or 2 minuses. If it performed the same as status quo or similar, had a 0, and then positive had 1 or 2 plus marks. So that was there to help show the relationship in maybe a little bit better way than maybe what just pure numbers could. And again, it's coarse, but just to kind of help with that visualization and to look at those consequences. Obviously can dive into the numbers, look at exact numbers when needed, but again, to help show that visualization, which I'll talk about in a second, but I think is a pretty cool thing that came out of this SDM process, looking specifically at CWD. So Again, I put on a hat that probably shouldn't put on too often, again, as an SDM expert, but I want to wrap it up with, as the committee leader in this process, how I thought SDM worked and the challenges and kind of benefits that it had throughout this committee process. And again, the response plan review itself is still ongoing, but the committee step is just about wrapped up for this step at least. So can kind of draw some conclusions or some things that I noticed, I guess, through the process. So definite challenge to having SDM through something like this is it was a learning process while we were doing it. It was new to me, it was new to the committee members, and many of the committee members are veterans of other committees, and some of them were veterans of the previous review process. And it was a challenge. It wasn't what we were used to doing. Wanted to get to the action step there, my bottom bullet, or didn't understand why we were focusing so long on this one step when really wanted to get to something maybe that they felt was a little more impactful. So that was definitely a challenge. And just not really knowing what the end product will look like. Yes, can show the slides of what it looks like for an airplane example, but how does that really translate to something as complex as CWD management? So I think there was some trust that needed to be gained there. I think it did get gained throughout the process, but there's definitely legitimate questions and kind of difficult doing something for the first time, essentially. But some benefits, even though it was painful, I think it did result in some clear objectives. I think some objectives were definitely the same from the previous review and the current response plan, of course, but I think some had some nice clarity to them and they were maybe simplified a bit because of the structure that it had to go through. And then what I just referenced in the previous slide, I think just that ability to visualize those trade-offs and consequences through either consequences table or looking at the numbers that come from the model, but just a way to compare and contrast these actions that I think a lot of us understand the impacts of, both from a social side and from a biological actually impacting the disease side, but comparing them all kind of in real time isn't the right way to put it, but maybe side by side, I think is something unique and something that this process is really gonna be, I think, interesting to a lot of folks and hopefully useful. And then as far as kind of the future, maybe this is something that now that it's been used once in a committee for the DNR, is it something available or useful to other committees or other natural resources issues within Wisconsin? Like I say, I think it was a really cool thing that we did here, and definitely things to improve on, but we'll see what the final product is. But I think it really showed some things that are helped show things that hopefully will be of interest to CWD management and looking at some of the products of this review. So with that, I think I used up enough time. Can go to questions if there are any. I think I see something in the chat, but I haven't quite read it yet. But that's it from me.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you very much, Curt. A lot of great information and great updates, especially for a program with so many moving parts. So the first question, and once again, if anybody has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. Scott Hingstrom has a question here. Curt, several states have been dealing with CWD for 10 to 12, 20 years. While I applaud the SDM approach for developing the new CWD plan, I have to wonder if we are trying to reinvent the wheel. How much external research and management experience has been brought into the planning process in Wisconsin?
Yeah, great question, Scott. I think the best way I can answer that is the Ventana, the bigger model approach, they're terming as systems approach, is not just Wisconsin specific. It actually just had this little one-off isn't the right way to put it, but this avenue for this response plan review. But there's a much bigger model there that is looking at other states' data, other states' activities, and using experts from other states. So I think there's a great opportunity there to not reinvent the wheel, use information that's ongoing in other areas to help inform this. So I think there's a great connection there, and that opportunity is definitely there through the model and the SDM approach.